I spent years paying for his apartment, covering the rent that kept his life comfortable. And the day I overheard him call me an embarrassment, I stopped in my tracks. I remember the cut of the words like a blade, how they echoed in a coffee shop that suddenly felt too bright and too loud. For decades, I believed family comes first. That belief nearly cost me my dignity. There was a small, private anger that rose in me that day, but it wasn't the only thing. It was clarity. My kindness had been mistaken for weakness, my loneliness mistaken for unlimited supply. My name is Linda, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the quiet life I pieced together for my son and the years of small, invisible sacrifices that led me to wire him money month after month. I had a pattern of putting others before me for so long that I hardly recognize the pattern anymore. After my divorce 20 years ago, I focused my small retirement on my son, Michael. He was bright, charismatic, and sure in a way that made me proud and nervous at the same time. He wanted a downtown apartment in a neighborhood where the restaurants changed with the seasons, the kind of place that came with keyed elevator access and lobby plants that never wilted. I wanted him safe, so I made choices. I sold my car instead of his and took the bus in rain and snow. I skipped little indulgences, no fancy vacations, just one annual weekend retreat with my book club. I skipped replacing the oven when it turned stubborn and old. When the market wobbled and my neighbors suggested keeping more of my savings liquid, I told myself that stability for Michael mattered more than new carpet or fresh curtains. The monthly wire to him became part of my routine, a fixed $3,500 that left my account on the first of every month. It covered his rent, utilities, and whatever else he said fell through the cracks of his budget. I wrote the transfer name Michael Harper, like signing a daily prayer. I told myself that my small, steady sacrifice was love. I told myself that because he was my son, it was what mothers did. At family dinners, I smiled through tiny slights. He would scoff gently at my anecdotes about the neighbors or the local library when his friends were over. "Mom, you still go to that place?" he'd say, half laughing. I laughed along. In the small moments, the text messages I answered at midnight, the pizza I bought on paydays when his card declined, I started to lose track of where the line between support and enabling was drawn. There were other signs I ignored. He didn't come home for important dates. He asked for loans for business ideas that never materialized, and I found myself adding them into the same bank window that paid his rent. He canceled visits because there was a concert that didn't match my taste, and I told myself he was young, he was social. The bills and bank statements were clinical reminders of the love I gave, numbers that left me thinner in my own life and fuller in his. The quiet things cut the deepest. How he never called on a snow day to ask if I made it safely to the grocery store. How he used my china for a big party he invited friends to and left a ring where the glaze chipped. Small disrespect built a rhythm I learned to ignore, but the money kept the rhythm steady. Family first, that mantra hummed in the background of my life, comforting me even as the evidence mounted that this arrangement was not a partnership. It was a one-way street. I told myself I was helping him build something. I paid for a nicer apartment so he could attract better jobs, better connections. I told myself that a comfortable home would keep him grounded. I didn't realize I was building a safety net he treated as a hammock. When friends asked, "Does he contribute to the household at all?" I blushed and lied. "He helps when he can," I would say, because shame was louder than truth. And isn't that the thing about giving until it hurts? The hurt becomes private, and the giving becomes a story told only in the spaces where you feel small. One winter evening, when the heater in my own apartment rattled and a dead bulb hung in my hallway, I wrote him a check for his deposit on an anniversary he forgot. I wrapped that check in care like a present and told myself, again, that mothers give even when it hurts. It never once occurred to me to ask him to look me in the eye and say thank you, not because I needed praise, but because I needed acknowledgement of the human effort behind the transfer. So the pattern continued: his comfortable apartment, my tightening budget, his glances of entitlement, my quiet compliance. It took 20 years for the ledger to become a ledger of loss. And yet no single transaction hurt as much as the night I overheard him laughing with friends about how I was embarrassing. It was a Saturday afternoon, late spring. I had taken my library book to a downtown coffee shop, my small indulgence to read for an hour in a chair that wasn't mine. Michael had texted he'd be coming by to pick up a thing and maybe catch a coffee. I thought of him with the casual warmth of a mother who never thought a child's affection would harden into indifference. He arrived with two men I didn't know, Brandon and Tyler. They were the kind of men whose laughter had a practiced brightness, with jackets that smelled faintly of new leather. I sat at a nearby table, my book open, but my ears tuned to the sound of him. I paid attention because there was a hope, a small childlike wish, that he would notice me there and wave me over. Instead, I heard his voice. It floated across the low hum of the shop, a smooth voice that didn't carry a single note of gratitude. "Mikey," Brandon said, his tone a gentle tease. "How do you manage to keep that place downtown? I thought you were more of a Brooklyn convert." Michael laughed, and the laugh cut like ice. "My mom wires me the rent," he said, like it was a badge. "Honestly, she thinks she's helping me by covering my base. She's so..." He glanced around and lowered his voice theatrically. "Embarrassing. She doesn't get the scene. She's adorable, like a clueless little grandmother." Tyler's laugh was sharp. "That's perfect. Let her keep thinking she's our moral compass, while you," he shrugged, eyes crinkling, "keep living nice. She'll never stop." My hand, I realized only later it had been holding my coffee, went numb. There was a slow, vertigo kind of clarity, as if I had been looking at a photograph and suddenly discovered it was a mirror. I watched him lean back, the confidence of a man who believed the world was neatly divided into givers and takers, and he was entitled to take. When he finally rose to leave, he kissed both their cheeks and turned away without looking my direction. I waited a beat, for an instinct I had nurtured for decades to emerge. He would notice me. He would wave. He didn't. He didn't even glance at my table. It was as if I had evaporated. The conversation had not been subtle. The way they mocked the idea of my sacrifices stung more than the lack of thanks ever had. That night, I let the grief come. I walked home with the trash of my illusions clinging to my coat. The city lights blurred. I thought of every time I had covered a missed payment, rearranged a budget, swallowed a hurtful word so that he could have something resembling comfort. Home that night felt both too big and suffocatingly small. I held the mug of tea I had bought for myself, but didn't sip. The words replayed in my head, each repetition like assault on old wounds. Old? I resented the label. Embarrassing? I resented that they could make my sincere, imperfect love sound like a joke. He had always assumed the money would come, automatic, unquestioned. It was part of the script he and his friends had written, and I had been performing without a script of my own. Their ridicule revealed the truth about how they'd been talking about me behind closed doors, as an endless resource to keep their lifestyle polished. The next morning, I woke before dawn with a quiet in my chest I had not felt in a long time. It wasn't just anger. It was a deep, aching recognition that I had been used. And within that ache was something else, relief, because for the first time in years, the truth was visible enough that I could no longer ignore it. He would later tell mutual friends that I had misunderstood or overreacted. He would say I had taken it the wrong way. But I did not misunderstand. I had heard the contempt in his voice. I had watched him choose their laughter over my presence. That was betrayal. To betray a person who consistently sacrifices for you is to treat their love as currency, not care. The wrongness of it sat heavy in me that morning, but so did a new resolution. I had a life to live, and I refused to let my dignity be the cost of someone else's comfort. I called the bank. Walking into the bank felt like stepping into a different kind of quiet. The fluorescent lights, the soft rustle of papers, the polite nod of the teller, These were ordinary things that had always softened my small anxieties. That day, they felt like witnesses to a decision I had not imagined I would make. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," said Miss Daniels at the counter, smiling. She had helped me for years. "How can I help you today?" I placed my hand over the familiar check register and steadied my voice. "I need to stop a wire transfer," I said simply. Ms. Daniels blinked in pleasant surprise. "Which one? We can set a pause if you like, or—" "No," I met her eyes. "I want it stopped permanently." She took my account information and typed with efficient calm. "To Michael Harper?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "to him, and to any recurring transfer he benefits from. I give this bank full permission to cancel anything under his name." There was a awkward pause. Ms. Daniels leaned in with genuine concern reserved for elderly clients and long-term accounts. "Mrs. Harper, are you sure? You've been sending this for as long as I can remember. It's a big change." "I'm sure," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "It's time." She looked down at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. "Sometimes people want a cooling-off period," she said. "It's a big move." "My heart is cooled," I answered. I thought of the coffee shop laughter, the way the word embarrassing had slid out from his mouth like a joke. I thought of every time I had put his needs before my own and received nothing but expectation in return. There is sometimes a gentleness in final decisions I hadn't anticipated, the clean line of them. "Do you want me to set a hold or just cancel the recurring instructions?" Ms. Daniels asked, professional, compassionate. I asked for cancellation. I signed the forms with a hand that didn't shake. I watched as the teller filed the document away, the motion ordinary and irrevocable. There was no dramatic speech, no confrontation in a lobby, just paper, ink, and a bank clerk doing her job. On my way out, I called to my neighbor, Elaine, who tended the flower boxes on our stoop. "Elaine," I said, surprising myself by saying, "I'm doing something for my peace." She smiled in that way that older neighbors do, understanding more than words. "Good for you, Linda," she said. "About time someone said enough." And that was it. I walked home lighter in a way that startled me. The money that had flowed from my account for 20 years was not just currency. It was a story woven into our relationship. By stopping the transfers, I was tearing out a thread I realized had been strangling me. I had no bitterness then, mainly clarity. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with setting a boundary. It's sharp, but also necessary. I spent the next weeks preparing for the practicalities of my new boundary. I rearranged some of my own finances. I reminded myself that I would still be a mother, but not a bank. I composed mental scripts for the calls I expected to receive. Michael would ask, he would plead, and he would demand. I resolved to be steady. The first time his voice shook, it was like a violin's thin string in a small room. "Mom," he said on the phone 2 days later, "I didn't get the wire." "I know," I said. There was no flinch in my voice, just the solid fact of a woman who had chosen. "I'm sorry, Michael. You can't do this," he said, panic skewing his usual suave tone. "I have bills. I have—" "Then make a plan," I said. "You are capable of it." The old scripts flashed behind his syllables: blame, guilt, emotional blackmail, but I had already rewritten mine. I refused to take on his debt as a lesson in my own self-sacrifice. Mothers teach, they enable sometimes, but there is dignity in allowing consequences to unfold when entitlement meets reality. Within a month, the notices began. At first, they were polite, emails that said that rent would be late. Then a second month's missed transfer escalated things. Michael called frantically. He texted insults. He tried to charm. He threatened to shame me to our circle with stories of a mother who turned her back. None of it moved me. I had mourned the relationship and found a backbone in the process. I had said no to a life that kept me small. When the eviction notice was slid under his apartment door, the script changed from financial jargon to raw, panicked reality. The landlord's words were clinical when he called, "We have to proceed if the balance isn't cleared." Michael's voice on the phone was no longer polished. It was brittle. "Mom," he whispered finally, full of something that sounded like a child who had lost his toy. "Please, I need you. I will pay you back. I'll get some money. I swear." I listened to the plea, the desperation like a cold wind. There was a pleading tone that had never come when I had asked him to call more often or to help around my place. He only sought me when the bills creaked. "I can't keep doing it, Michael," I said. "I gave you a chance to grow. This is on you." He accused me later to friends and to those who would listen that I had given up on him. He painted me as harsh. But the truth is, a mother who enforces boundaries isn't cruel. She is teaching an adult to carry their own life. The day the eviction notice said the tenant must vacate was the day Michael's world contracted. It isn't violent in the cinematic sense. There's no dramatic chase or public shouting. There is a series of small, inevitable collapses when someone dependent on another's money suddenly must account for itself. He called his so-called friends first. Brandon and Tyler, who had laughed with him that afternoon in the coffee shop, were suddenly inconvenient. "We didn't sign up to become landlords," Brandon said, voice thin when Michael told him the truth. "I mean, dude, you can't expect us to cover you." Tyler's sympathy was a performance that faded the moment he realized there was no profit in it. They left texts unread. They stopped answering calls. I watched from my window one night as Michael walked with no direction, a man suddenly light on his feet in a way that wasn't freedom, but aimless despair. The landlord, who had been reasonable in the past, had a mandate to keep the property paid. Notices became letters, then phone calls. Michael's options shrank to a single small list: find a cheaper place, borrow from someone he trusted, or move back in with a parent. Pride met reality and lost. There is a particular quiet in a place when a person is preparing to leave. On his last morning in that downtown apartment, there were boxes. They sat half-packed like the remnants of a life paused. Items that had once signified trend and comfort now looked like props in a play closing. When he came to my door, he came with the emptiness of a man who had nowhere else to go. There was no grand apology, not at first, just a weight that made his shoulders slump. I opened the door a crack the moment he knocked, a chain still on the lock, because that is the way I always kept it. He looked smaller than I remembered. The polished edges of his arrogance were gone, and the face was raw. He was a man who had relied on someone else's steadying hand until the hand no longer moved for him. "Mom," he said, and for the first time it wasn't a perfunctory "Mom," but the sound of someone seeking refuge. "Please, I need a place, just for a little while." I looked at him. For a moment I thought of the years of lost sleep, of mending broken things, of paying for a world he enjoyed. I thought of the nights I had sat alone, and thought of him dancing in glitzy bars or laughing with friends who would not carry him when he slipped. The old longing tugged. He was my child, and children are instinctively forgiven by their parents. But forgiveness isn't always the same as rescue. There is a stern, compassionate line between the two. When someone has had repeated chances to accept responsibility and has chosen entitlement instead, rescue only reinforces the harmful script. So I kept the chain on the lock. "Michael," I said, my voice calm, steady, neither icy nor cruel. "You know I love you." Tears filled his eyes. I'm so sorry. I never meant." "You meant to live here," I replied. "You meant for me to cover your rent. That was a choice you made, and it's shown me who you are when your life is quiet and when it's social. I won't erase the lessons you were supposed to learn." He sank onto the stoop, the city noise a distant ocean. He begged and promised and offered things that sounded hollow. "I'll go to therapy," he said. "I'll find work. I'll do anything. Please, Mom." "I can't undo what you did to yourself," I said. "I can't be your lifelong safety net. Grow up, Michael." Those words landed with more weight than I expected. They weren't flung like an accusation. They were offered like a boundary. In the silence that followed, I saw something like grief cross his face. Not the theatrical grief he showed before, but a deeper realization that his actions had consequences he couldn't charm away. He left. He wandered through a few sleeping arrangements, a friend's couch here, a short-term sublet there. None of it was comfortable. The faces that had laughed with him at the coffee shop were not there to pick up his pieces. Their convenience with him had a limit. When supporting him cost something tangible, their hands closed. There was a moment, a quiet justice that didn't look like triumph, but like the simple arithmetic of cause and effect. He had built a life on someone else's largesse. When that largesse stopped, the foundation shifted. Natural consequences arrived with the slow inevitability of the tide. People ask if I felt satisfaction. The truth is, I felt a great many things. Sorrow for what it took to arrive here, relief for the space reclaimed, and a kind of peace that can only come when a person honors their own worth. It was not revenge as spectacle. It was the dignity of a woman saying, "Enough," and the universe following through. The begging came predictably. Letters, calls, a few trembling knocks on my door. Sometimes he called me at odd hours. Sometimes he sent long emails pledging change and promising repayment. There were days when anger rose quick and hot, but anger is not always the right answer. My response was calm, concise, and unwavering. When he stood on my stoop months later, having disheveled clothes and a shaky voice, I did what I had learned to do. I listened without undoing the boundary. He had tears in his eyes that had nothing to do with manipulation. "Mom," he said, "I messed up. I see it now. Please forgive me." Forgiveness is a gift you can give, but it must be given on your terms, not as a bandage to heal someone else's wounds so they can go on bleeding irresponsibly. I had forgiven him in my heart for his human failures. Children will always be children in our memory. But forgiveness did not mean I would return to old habits that had hollowed me out. Forgiveness doesn't mean I'll go back to being the bank, I told him. I forgive you for being imperfect. I do not forgive the entitlement. He wanted his old life back without demonstrating real change. He wanted me to resume the automatic payments and to swallow the sting of being mocked. He wanted the comfort of my giving without the discomfort of accountability. I refused. "I won't give you the money," I said, soft but firm. "I won't erase the consequences so you don't have to do the work." He left again, not yet healed, but perhaps beginning a journey he had always postponed. I didn't watch him go. I turned my back and poured myself a cup of tea. The smell of bergamot and heat filled my small kitchen like a benediction. What I did next was simple and wholly mine. I went to book club that evening, walked into a room full of women who had their own quiet histories of giving and reclaiming, and I settled into a chair with my cup and my latest read. The chatter that afternoon was a comforting murmur, discussions about characters and plots, but also small confessions about life. "Linda," Martha called when she saw me. "You look lighter." I smiled. "I feel lighter," I said, and I did. There was a buoyancy that came not from punishment, but from the relief of no longer carrying what I was never meant to hold alone. Outside, the city kept its rhythms. Inside, my friends and I shared more than books. We shared advice, laughter, and support. I found tenderness in the ordinary, stirring soup on a Sunday, attending a lecture at the library, sitting on the park bench, and watching golden leaves tumble in autumn wind. Those small pleasures became the scaffolding of a life I was rebuilding. There are days I still ache for what could have been. A mother's heart is stubbornly hopeful. I hope Michael learns to keep his commitments. I hope he finds humility and uses it to build a life of his own making, but I no longer tether my self-worth to his choices. I had lived too long as an invisible source, and revoking that invisibility was my salvation. Sometimes neighbors see him on the bus. Sometimes he sends a hesitant message sharing a small victory. When they come, I receive them with guarded warmth. I will always love my son. That love doesn't require me to be erased. My decision to stop funding him was not a dramatic act of cruelty. It was a boundary, a reclamation, a quiet but powerful no that allowed both of us to face the truth of who we had become. For him, it was the rude awakening that life demands participation. For me, it was the first breath of a new chapter. I learned that boundaries heal. They are not walls built of bitterness, but bridges formed from respect for one's own needs. The day I kept the chain on the door and told my son to grow up, I didn't close my heart. I opened up the possibility for both of us to finally become honest adults. So tonight, I sit with my book, a steaming cup by my hand, and a circle of friends who have become a second family. The small apartment smells of lemon polish and lavender. There is a postcard from a niece on the fridge. I watch the sun drop behind the buildings and feel grateful for the ordinary peace of an evening that is mine. If anything in my story strikes a chord with you, let me know where you're watching from. Tell me your own stories of setting a hard boundary and the relief that followed. And remember, protecting your peace is not selfish. It is survival, dignity, and sometimes the only way you can teach those you love how to stand on their own 2 feet. The end of my giving did not mark an end to love. It marked the start of a healthier life, one in which I, finally, was allowed to rest.